Okay. Well, greetings, everyone. Welcome to Anthro Perspectives. I'm Keith Kellerson. I'm an applied business and organizational anthropologist. Today, I have with me Dr. Robert Morais, who is also a consumer anthropologist and has had a strong career working in consulting with companies such as Procter & Gamble, GlaxoSmithKline, Coca-Cola, and Dan, just to name a few. His publications include 5 books and over 50 articles and book chapters, and he currently teaches at the Columbia Business School. So thank you for the time to talk to us today. I've given you a brief introduction. Why don't you tell everyone a little bit more about yourself and your career history?
Sure. Thanks a lot for inviting me to do this, Keith.
You're very welcome.
I received my doctorate in 1980. I focused on cultural anthropology with a specific concentration in psychological and cognitive anthropology. And my geographical area was Southeast Asia. Did my doctoral research in the Philippines. Taught very briefly, didn't like the look of the academic job market, and also decided I didn't think I wanted to do this. What I thought I'd do for the rest of my life wasn't then what I thought I would want to do for the rest of my life. Got wind of a program at NYU's business school that essentially refitted humanities and social science PhDs to work in business. The program was called Careers in Business. It had been around a few years. There were 60 people every year in the program, a few anthropologists, a few other social scientists, other people from the humanities, English, French literature, and so on. Anyway, I did that program, and then I got a job at Gray Advertising in New York. That was in 1981. And I'd done a little consulting along the way, and I hadn't had that much exposure in business. Consulting had been to a company called Overseas Briefing, which helped people relocate overseas. That was kind of an interesting way of getting introduced to the business world. And when I started out in advertising, I started out in account management and put my PhD on the shelf and didn't do a whole lot with it. And then I started noticing articles in Advertising Age by a guy named Steve Barnett, who was writing about the application of anthropology in advertising and marketing. But I thought, gee, I don't know if I want to do that. I have a good job. I'm working for a good company. Every once in a while when we do research, I would think, as an anthropologist would think about the research, but I wasn't really doing a whole lot with it. And then there was a field that started to emerge a little bit in the United States in the mid to late 1980s, but really got some traction in the 90s, called account planning, which is really the strategic side of advertising. Account managers would do that, and companies that I worked for, when I was an account manager, I would do a lot of the strategy. But account planning was a research and strategy job. And eventually I found myself getting more and more interested in that, and then entered that as really doing mostly that in advertising. And along the way, I started bringing in some anthropology. So starting in the early 1990s, I did some ethnographies. I was bringing in a little bit of theory, but not a lot. It wasn't a big part of my job. And then it started emerging. There was this field called business anthropology, although I don't know if it was called that then. And as I learned more and more about it, I said, I think I can do more of this. I started seeing more and more ethnography applied in business, often by people who really weren't quite sure what ethnography was, and I thought I could do better. And so I was doing more and more of that, incorporating that in my job. And then in 2006, I was invited to join a market research firm to succeed one of the partners who was retiring. I'd known the principals for a long time. It was a mid-sized firm, about 12, 15 people at the time, 15 people, I guess, at the time. And so I brought anthropology to them. They had one archaeologist, but he focused on quantitative market research. The other people were mainly consumer psychologists. So I was able to do more of that. And then spent 11 years doing that. And then in 2017, I retired from corporate life. And along the way, starting about 15 years ago, maybe a little longer actually, I started writing. I guess it was more than 15 years ago. 15 years ago, I started doing some more academic writing. Before that, I was talking about anthropology, specifically ethnography, in some sort of general publications like Advertising Age and a few other places. So I started getting more interested in scholarship in business anthropology, and so I've worked in that area too. And now I teach part-time in a business school.
Yeah. It's amazing some of the people I've talked to who have long careers in, things that had really nothing to do with anthropology, and then go back, they rediscover anthropology,
Right,
and they go back to school and they're like, this is what I want to do. This explains everything.
right.
I had somewhat of that experience because I had my undergrad in anthropology and kind of put it on the shelf until many, many years of working in the corporate world. And
Yeah,
I rediscovered the business anthropology, program at UNT. And, it was very, very exciting to me.
yeah.
So, yeah. So, you describe yourself as a consumer anthropologist. And of course, I describe myself as a business and organizational anthropologist. So why don't you tell everyone a little bit more about what a consumer anthropologist is and what kind of business areas they can be valuable in?
Well, a consumer anthropologist is someone who applies anthropological methods, not just ethnography, but primarily ethnography, and anthropological ideas. Sometimes those ideas are theoretical ideas.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes they're just a kind of sensibility, a way of thinking about things, like holism. You probably in every one of your interviews, people have mentioned holism.
Holism, absolutely.
And so, and the culture concept.
Yeah.
But those are, what happens in consumer anthropology is it becomes a little bifurcated. So on one side, there's the basic ethnography, observational work without any theory at all. And then there is some that incorporates theory. It might be ethnographic in terms of method, but you can apply theory in focus groups. I've done that.
Yes.
And so you can mix and match a bit. But the main objective is to try to get into the minds and the hearts and the lives
Mm-hmm.
of people that buy products, more specifically brands, when you think about the consumer world,
Mm-hmm.
and understand them in ways that, say, a consumer psychologist wouldn't, a typical market researcher wouldn't. And that really is, so part of it's the methodology, as in the ethnography, but it's also that idea of bringing some of the theory that we have and the ideas that we have to see things in a different way than others would. So that's how we are. And we look at every category you can imagine. So if you can think of something that you buy, whether it's in a supermarket or a car dealership, or go to a hotel, or, well, really anything, computer, everything we're using now, a house, all of those things can be the subject of study by a consumer anthropologist.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because a while back I did sort of a collaborative article with a marketing firm.
Right.
And they wanted me to talk about anthropology and how anthropology impacts marketing. So that really wasn't my forte, but
Right.
nonetheless, I knew I could somewhat speak on it.
Right.
And I ended up talking about the use of color in advertising and the use of color and shape in logos.
Yeah.
And one of the things I found that was really just, it's a very prime example about how anthropology works in that space, because I looked at the logo for Volkswagen. Now, a lot of people know, if they think of the Volkswagen logo, it's blue and metallic silver, and it's kind of a 3D round effect.
Right.
Well, Volkswagen recently changed that. They flattened it, and they made it blue and white, and they made all the lines thinner, and it looks very, very generic, to us. To us, United States, it looks generic. It's not flashy. But to Germany, this is perfect, right? Because we don't need all of these things. We just need very simple, right? And that's that culture's aesthetic. And, if you go back to like the Bauhaus school of art, these very simplistic things. And I just absolutely fascinated me, because I think to us that logo looks very boring, very unattractive. But to them, it's extremely artistic, it's simple, it's straight to the point, and that's the message they want to get across.
Yeah, yeah. And so a consumer anthropologist who was assigned to, let's say, either help create a logo for, let's just begin with a US company, but then start thinking of it as a multinational company, would be well served to go through a discovery process, looking at all the different places that the logo would appear, and ultimately try to find what was culturally appropriate. On the other hand, most companies don't want to have 50 different logos.
Correct.
So there might be small variations, but
Mhm.
usually what the consumer anthropologist would do would work with, say, a multinational corporation and say, well, here's what's going to work in most of the places where you're going to have most of your business.
Mhm.
And it really depends on who controls the logo. So if it's a German
Right.
company, they can control it. If it's a US-based company, they can control it, even if they're going abroad.
Mhm.
But the discovery process is really important to what we do. It's the listening and observing part of who we are and what we're good at, and understanding what's happening on the ground. And also looking in this case, because you're talking about what are the other preferences aesthetically,
Mhm.
um, what are the, it's not even just an aesthetic thing, what is the connection between form and
Right.
content and so on in
Mhm.
any society. So yeah, I mean, anthropologists certainly, consumer anthropologists would certainly love to work on a project like that.
Yeah, yeah, art and color and all of those things. Yeah.
It's actually in the packaging world, people spend a lot of time thinking about these things.
Mhm.
Packaging varies cross-culturally quite a bit, and you can see that whenever you travel from one place to another. And a lot of companies will vary their packaging, not just obviously in the language, but in the key visuals, in the typefaces, in the relative size of certain images, a specific image is chosen.
Mhm. Mhm. So from working in such a wide variety of industries, like I had talked about when I introduced you, what are some common insights that you as a consumer anthropologist find when identifying market opportunities for companies?
It's an interesting question.
Yeah.
Insights is a tough word
Yeah.
because usually the way I think of an insight is, you have a finding, which is just, something you've observed or heard or you found out. And then you want to elevate that to maybe it's through an epiphany where you realize, well, this has some real implications for the market that I want to reach.
Mhm.
Uh, and so you're raising the level raising your level of thinking from sort of the basic finding itself to something much greater that, in the case of a consumer anthropologist, your client can use or the company you work for can use. So, but I would say that one commonality could be that we apply certain ways of thinking to different processes or different things that a consumer behaviors that a consumer company might focus on. So, for example, take the consumer or customer journey. There's something called customer journey mapping.
Yeah.
It's very widely used. It's taught in business schools, and it's basically a sequence. It's from when you first start to think about either entering a category or using a category or changing your brand preference in a category to moving into the next phase of selecting among the competitive brands which one you want, or maybe upgrading the current product you have to a higher level product, to another phase, which is more of a usage and then a post-usage phase, and then maybe you even become either an advocate for the brand or a critic. Well, what an anthropologist can do is say, well, so we have this structure, and we can look at this structure a number of different ways. One is that we can think not just about asking questions, but we can look at it in real time. So we can apply ethnography. So we can observe people as they're going through each phase. So when I was looking at people who were baking brownies and cakes, I wanted to start out with, where do they get their ideas from recipes? Well, I was in their homes. So I could watch them as they hunted, not only online, but one of them went to an old cookbook that her father had given her, and he'd circled certain things. But I could really get a feel for how she went about her journey. And then we would go to stores with people. I'd go with my client, for example, or maybe a colleague, and then we would watch people shop. So we'd be doing in-store ethnographies or shop-alongs, as they're sometimes called. And that's another phase of that process, of that journey. Then we go back with them to their homes. We'd first be in their homes, then we'd go back shopping, then back to their homes. We'd watch them use what they bought, prepare it. We'd watch that part of it. And then if it could get done in the time that we were there, which usually could, because we were there for a while, we'd taste it.
Yeah.
And if it wasn't done, we would call them back after, a day or two later and say, well, how did everybody like what you made, and so on. So part of what I'm talking about is using an anthropological method such as ethnography and watching in real time how people have this journey. Another thing you can do is look at it almost as a rite of passage. So,
Yes.
you think of kind of your separation from the way you usually do things or the way you usually live. Now I'm going to bake. So now you're separating yourself kind of emotionally, not
Mhm.
just intellectually, from the rest of your world, and you're focusing on thinking about what you're going to make. Why are you going to make it? Is it a special occasion or for special people or whatever?
Mhm.
And then you're moving into all those different phases. And, which is the liminal phase? Well, it kind of depends. The liminal phase, liminality sort of travels in a way. So those middle phases, that there's a beginning, a middle, and an end, in a way, to every single one of those phases. So you can break it down and take a deeper look at each one of them. And so now you're using a kind of framework that is derived from anthropology, and you're bringing your client along with you, saying, maybe you're using the word liminality, maybe not, but you're talking about slowing the behavior down, looking at the kinds of transformative experiences that not only occur in each phase, but especially occur in those liminal moments where, as I like to say, stuff happens.
Yeah.
So that's an example in a broad way, so it's not insight per se. But then there are insights that are driven by specific assignments. So for example, I'll give you two. One of them was in doing ethnography in a luxury hotel.
Oh.
The client was very interested in what luxury is. Is luxury just high-class service? Is it top end? What is it? So people, when you interview people, they basically give you all those answers. And then you try to ask them more probing questions, and maybe you use some metaphorical tools, like you can use something called a Z-med and other things that are not just from anthropology, because anthropologists love to borrow, and market researchers really love to borrow, and we take from everywhere. So you can have those discussions, but it really helps to have those discussions in a luxury hotel, where, as I said, stuff happens. So I'm sitting there doing an interview with someone, and I'm taking notes, and my pen either runs out of ink or something's happening to my pen. And it's clear, anybody looking at me could see that my pen wasn't working. This is when people took notes with pens. It wasn't that long ago, really. And someone came over to me. Oh, by the way, the hotel was the Plaza Hotel. So speaking of high class. The person came over. He wasn't the waiter, wasn't the maitre d', but he was someone else who worked in the Plaza. And he didn't say a word, but he, in a very subtle way, just put the pen, a Plaza pen, right next to me and walked away. And the person that I was talking to, the interviewee, said, that's what I'm talking about. That's what I mean when I talk about luxury. As we get engaged in a conversation about it, because that's what we love to do as anthropologists, we love to have conversations, not just ask straight questions. It was clear that luxury was about delivering all of these things that were associated with luxury, but delivering them in a way that wasn't in your face, that was much more subtle, and that made the person feel that they were elevated. Because it wasn't, oh, I have a pen for you, and the person didn't interrupt my conversation, didn't interrupt the interview, didn't make a big deal out of it. And the person I was interviewing felt, rightly or wrongly, that that was really very much, in her mind, emblematic of what the Plaza experience was like. And then another example, should I give you another example?
Sure, go right ahead, please.
Another example is, it's actually in a paper that I have coming out in the Journal of Business Anthropology on fresh pet dog food. And this was a project, it was the last big project I did before I retired from the corporate world. And the client came to my company and they wanted my partner and myself both on the project, which didn't always happen. And they wanted my partner to do focus groups and focus on psychological theory and bring that into the conversation. And they wanted me to do ethnographies and bring in anthropological ideas. And so it was an interesting approach. It wasn't really a contest between the two, although ultimately, you'd have some brand positionings coming out of that, which was really the ultimate objective for the company. And you might do some A/B testing, see which one won. But the interesting part of it from an anthropological standpoint was that not only was it the contrast in terms of what we learned about how people's lives are lived, but we heard a lot of stories. Everybody tells you they love their dogs, they feel like they're parents, dogs are part of the family. But somehow when we were in people's homes, and the client was with me, and that always happens, or almost always happens, we heard stories about how dogs, well, here's a great one. A mom was talking about how her daughter and her dog were great friends. And when they did something wrong, one of them did something wrong, they would sit on the couch when she was scolding them. The mom was scolding the daughter and the dog, and the daughter and the dog would look at each other, and each one would be thinking, oh, who's going to get in trouble for this? And I didn't say to them, so is the dog thinking the way you are? But of course, they didn't really think the dog was thinking that.
Right.
They were anthropomorphizing the dog to a degree. But the point was, it was underscoring to me the importance of the dog in the family in terms of actually being sort of, a player. Well, see, sometimes I get these weird things where my email comes up. Well, don't worry about it while I'm on the phone.
That's fine.
On the video. So as we're talking, and I'm thinking about the position of the dog within the family, I'm also thinking of dog food within the family and how they think about dog food, and I'm having them talk about how they think about human food versus dog food, and I'm asking them some fundamental questions about what food is and what dog food is and what human food is. And then I have them do a kind of on the table, sort of laying it on the table almost as a continuum. If this is human food, how close is dog food to human food? Right. And then I said, there are basically two categories that most marketers think of, and that consumers seem to think of in the dog food category. Dry dog food, like in a bag, and wet dog food in a can. And I asked them to contrast those two. What I learned is that on one hand, they thought wet dog food seemed more fresh, it seemed tastier. They didn't want to just give that to the dogs because they thought it was healthy to sometimes mix them and so on. But the other thing is that I realized that dog food in their minds at some level wasn't really binary, wet versus dry. It was more of a hierarchy, that there was human food at the very top, which they only rarely gave their dog other than scraps from the table, which they would give, but they would very rarely prepare dog food, human food for their dog. And there was dry food and there was wet food. And then there was an opportunity for the brand I was working on, Pet Fresh, to situate itself in this hierarchy as essentially moving from dry food to wet food to Pet Fresh and positioning it closer to human food. Uh-huh. Now, Pet Fresh, by the way, is found, not all of it, but a lot of the SKUs, stock keeping units, are found in the refrigerator case. So it's sort of like human food in that way anyway. But the point is that I was able to kind of do almost a cognitive analysis of how people thought. They revealed that to me through these exercises, but also to talk to my client and say, you've separated the category into these two areas. Maybe you should think of it not so much as a binary, but as a hierarchy. And maybe there's an opportunity to say to people, fresh pet is not just wet food or dry food. It's more like fresh food. And so it was a way of repositioning the brand, and the client loved it. And so that was a way of taking some ideas that were somewhat anthropological and using them. Related to that was the whole idea of challenging the client. When we went shopping with people, we saw that the refrigerator case that this food was in was invisible to them. And of course, my first observation there was that it was because it was an unfamiliar location. It didn't belong. Refrigerated pet food just doesn't make sense to a lot of people until after they bring it home and then the refrigerator. They don't really buy it from a refrigerator case. So the challenge, borrowing from an anthropological idea, was to make the unfamiliar familiar. How do they, through signage and other methods, make something like a refrigerator case in a pet food store or in a grocery store in a pet food section become more familiar to consumers so that they see it, it's not invisible to them. So
that's interesting because the grocery store near me just redid the inside of their whole grocery store and rearranged it.
Right.
I walked down the pet food aisle and I noticed that there was a refrigerator there with fresh food, fresh cat and dog food in it that I had never seen before. So I don't know if, they had it hidden somewhere, which I never noticed before, or right. They finally put it in the pet food aisle where it makes sense, where right. Like what you said, people are going to see it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, but as far as now, my cats only get, the wet cat food or dry cat food. I haven't got the luxury Pet Fresh food for them yet. So that's all they're getting.
Yeah.
So speaking in the context of consumer anthropology and marketing, what do hiring managers and recruiters in companies need to know to understand the value of the anthropological skill set?
Well, it's interesting because we're competing with a wide range of skill sets
That's true.
and expertise these days.
Mhm.
So most people in marketing know what ethnography is. It's a tool.
Yeah.
We do focus groups, we do in-depth interviews, one-on-one interviews. We do friendship groups. Now, of course, you do things virtually. You have to, but that was happening anyway. We do ethnographies. It's just all part of it. So I think one thing that we have to convey as anthropologists is that we bring, number one, a special level of training and expertise in ethnography. We're just better at listening and observing.
Mhm.
Part of that's being more systematic, but also just maybe paying a little more attention than somebody who's not as well trained. The other part of it is that we are because we don't have to. Not everyone who studied anthropology is strong theoretically,
Right.
but if you have just enough of a sensibility, if you've read just enough
Mhm.
to understand where you can apply an idea that's rooted in anthropology, the way I think about it is that you can turbocharge your basic observational research or even your focus groups or anything that you're doing in market research to another level of understanding and insight. And so that's a big plus. You don't have to get long-winded about it with somebody, but you can basically give some examples. I think it's a really good idea with hiring managers to always come in armed with, here's what I do, and here's an example of either what I've done or what someone else has done that's really been effective for a company.
So what do you think are the top skills that anthropologists of any specialty can bring to any company?
Well, so, obviously we bring a special brand of ethnography, and that's probably what I would say about it. In other words, being in the world of marketing, I would reposition my competition as being sort of a superficial or a lighter form of ethnography, and say what I enable my clients to do is dig deeper and
Right.
think deeper, and then reveal, as I said, insights, and you were talking about insights before, that are uncommon. And the more I can say about that, the more I think I can convince them that maybe I'm worth hiring.
Right.
I also think that anthropologists can add enormously to a couple of areas that are very hot now. So user experience, or UX,
Yep.
design research, and there are anthropologists that have written about design research, but there are a lot of people that are moving ahead with design research and not paying a whole lot of attention to anthropologists.
Right.
There are some companies that give lip service to it, that hire people that have experience in anthropology, and they're bringing a lot to that party. But if you look at the way a lot of design is taught and a lot of UX is taught, for example, in business schools, they talk about different phases of discovery and evaluation in their design development process or their UX process. They talk about agile research, which is really just, sped up research, often done incredibly superficially with a tiny, tiny sample. And most people I know, colleagues of mine at Columbia Business School, I talk about this with, we all think that, it's a little bit of a marketing trick to talk about, agile and to talk about and design thinking. It's valuable, but sometimes it leaves things off the table. And design thinkers talk a lot about empathy. Well, it seems to me we're really good at, number one, discovery, because we can discover, we know how to ask the right questions, better questions. We can bring in that kind of sensibility that I've been talking about that might inform the analysis, whether it is some kind of analytical framework or something that will help the designer or the UX person really deepen their knowledge. And empathy is really that word. I mean, really they're feeling about what the consumer or user wants and may not even know that they want. And then on the other side of it, which is the assessment end, you go out, you find out what you think consumers want, or you discover gaps in the marketplace, you build it, and then you test it. And the testing is usually done very quickly. Well, testing these things in real time using some ethnographic methods really exploring them, bringing back ideas like the customer journey, but then bringing that anthropological sensibility to it can be really helpful. Connecting user experience and design to people's lives. So there's that word holistic again. So you're getting a bigger, broader picture of how a product really fits in people's lives. Those are big pluses. So we can bring those kinds of things to basic market research, to user experience studies, to product design and innovation, all those things. I think we can bring a lot. And of course, it depends on who you're talking to. The hiring manager for any given job will want something different. So you have to make sure you're focused on it.
It's interesting because when I started my program at UNT, I remember someone coming in with a story that they had answered a job description in the paper or online or whatever for an ethnographer.
Yeah.
And what it was somebody standing in the middle of a shopping mall getting people to fill out a quick survey.
Right.
So, I think, and I've heard these kind of things, I've seen this theme of, yes, companies want ethnography, but they want it to be a quick survey.
Yeah.
They want qualitative research, but, we're not going to put that as much weight as a quantitative research and just get a few ideas from a few people, just talk to a few people and find out, right?
Yeah.
So there's this struggle between speed, or at least what they see as speed, and, I guess you could say the quality of the research, and that's always kind of a struggle there. But I think too, in American culture, we always think faster is better. If it's faster, it's got to be better, right?
Yeah.
And I think that kind of fueled the whole sort of fast food thing. We want everything faster, but fast food isn't always better food, right?
Right.
So,
But it tastes good, and marketers like things that taste good.
Absolutely. So if it's fast and it tastes good, that we're good. That's all we need.
Right.
But there's this thing of, when you talk about ethnography or you talk about qualitative research, I think sometimes companies may be a little afraid, like, how long is that going to take, and how long is this research going to take? Well, here's the thing: do you want quality, or where can you tell me where quality and time sort of kind of fights with each other in sort of thing, And when I was at Toyota, I heard a Japanese manager say something very smart. He said, it's more important to be efficient. It's more important to be effective than efficient.
Yeah.
That's always stuck with me because I'm thinking, again, in our culture, faster is always better. But at Toyota, more effective is better. And, sometimes when I was at Toyota, I would talk to my colleagues and my coworkers, and we would say, how the heck do we ever build a single car here? Because everything takes so long to get done. You work on a report for months,
right,
critique for months, but somehow we end up having like the #1 selling car like 20 years in a row.
Right.
So I think that's a struggle for companies, and I think that in itself is a great research project to see where companies, where that tension lands between time and quality.
Well, you brought up a couple of interesting points. I'm going to go back to the first thing you were talking about, and we can maybe go into the others too. But the first thing you mentioned was this, when ethnography is conflated with some other kind of research that isn't at all like ethnography.
Right.
I guess some people think that if you're outside or you're in a mall, that's ethnographic. If you're just trying to do surveys outside or in a mall, not quite the same. And I think, again, we can try to make that distinction clear. One of the things that really got me upset when I was watching a presentation on design thinking, and the person kept going over and over, talking a lot about and going over and over about, we need to do ethnography, and then described ethnography basically as an interview. And certainly interviewing is part of ethnography, but it's much more than that. Right. And forget anything about anthropological ideas. Right. I'm talking now about just the basic method itself. And so one of the things that I do in my teaching is to make it really clear what we mean by ethnography, what we mean by a survey. I found out something really interesting a few years ago, is that a lot of people in at least some marketing departments think that surveys are qualitative research. And I think they think that because of the crafting of the questions, right. And they can, but because that's a qualitative part of it, but the analytical part of it, of course, and sample size, that's all going to be in the quantitative side. as far as companies and convincing them of the value, I'll say a couple of things about that. One of them is that my research company, it still exists, Weinmann Morais, they're still in business. We used to say, sometimes jokingly to clients, if they were trying to convince us to do something fast, cheap, and basically counterproductive.
That's cheap and good, right?
Yeah, we would say, it's better to do no research than bad research. So if you don't have the time and you don't have the money to do this right, at least basically right, then you shouldn't do it. Use your judgment, because sort of a corollary to that is good judgment is better than bad research. And judgment is risky. There's a lot of bias. And of course, you're better off doing research, but you got to do good research.
Right.
And the last thing I'll say about all this is that, what I would convince clients when I had trouble sometimes convincing clients that they should do something like ethnography instead of, say, focus groups or a quick survey, and they would say, but we're not going to produce that much data. Usually it would be between focus groups and an ethnography, because the survey was a different animal. And I would say, we have to do the survey. In fact, my company did quantitative and still does qualitative and quantitative research. So, we made money either way. But what I would say is that, you're going to actually produce more data. Now, I like to make a distinction between findings and data. I like to call it we're producing qualitative findings.
Right.
Because when you call it data, yeah, I can see.
Right.
It's a little dangerous. But whether it's findings or data, if that's the word they want to use, learning their language and speaking it is really important for clients.
That's right.
So what you see produced out of a relatively small number of ethnographies will be far more than you would produce, say, in focus groups. 1 day, 2 days of focus groups versus, several days out in the field. Maybe you're only interviewing and doing ethnographies and doing whatever you're doing for, with 2 people a day, which is really as many as you can really do. And it's a long day, and it depends on the kind of product it is. And they would always they would have said, okay, yeah, well, we understand, because I'd always invite them to the field and they'd come along and they'd see. And then, of course, the insights generated would go back to what I said before, which is that they're uncommon. They're not what they would have expected. There's something different that they got out of the ethnographies that they ultimately agreed they wouldn't have gotten it in a focus group, because people were just remembering, they were reporting in the focus groups. We were watching them live. Even though we were there, we were still watching them live. And that matters. So people can usually get the value of that, because you always remind them their products are being used products are being used in real time in real people's lives. They're not being used in a focus group facility or while they're filling out a survey.
Yeah. Great stuff. So really, that's all the questions I have for you today. Is there anything else you want to add?
The only thing I'll add is that I teach mostly MBAs. Some of my students are Master of Science students. And you might be surprised, and you'll certainly be happy to hear, that at least several of them every semester say, based on what I learned in this class, I think I might want to rethink what I want to do in my career. And I don't think it's just me. I think it's what they're hearing. I think it's the cases they're hearing, the articles they're reading. The excitement they feel about what you're talking about, the quality of qualitative research, and particularly the kind of thinking that anthropologists and other social scientists can bring to a marketing problem. It gets them excited. They're not going to say, well, they don't, they have to do quant. They know they have to do quant. And, we even talk about ways that qualitative and quantitative are coming together and informing one another. That's a big part of a class that I co-teach. But it's gratifying to know that people in business schools, at least some of them, and there's some other anthropologists that are teaching in business schools too, are able to convince the students that there is real value in the kind of expertise that we bring, and this huge body of knowledge that we can really adapt from academic thinking to and apply it to real world business problems.
That's great. That's really great. And that does encourage me a lot. And I think it will encourage a lot of people that see this video, is that, people who are going into, strict business programs, marketing or MBAs and that sort of thing, they're hearing about this anthropology. Like, what does that have to do with business? And they're
Right.
reading about qualitative research and ethnography. And then when they start to understand it, then, oh my gosh, here comes that great awakening,
Right.
some of us have had when we
Right.
discovered business anthropology. And I think too, talking to some of the people, I've been going to some meetups and things like that, people are really getting more interested in qualitative research because the quantitative research, the quantitative data is not telling them why a condition is the way it is. And there's so much time and so much discussion happening on what the quantitative data means and what is it really about. And if they only had the qualitative data, if they only had someone, that kind of ethnographic researcher in there to help translate it, they would cut their meeting time like in a fraction of what it is, because they're spending so much time just talking about it. And
Yeah.
then when it comes time to make a decision, they're nervous because they're like, well, I don't know if this is going to be the right decision or not. The data says this, but I don't know. And so, I think really companies, they like I said, it's more important to be effective than efficient. I mean, you've got to get as much data as you can and take the time with it. It's just like building a product, or a design product. I mean, if you don't take time with it, you're going to look over safety stuff, and then you're going to have recalls, and then you're going to have all these other problems.
Oh yeah, it's more expensive to do the wrong research or not do research than it is to take that little
Front end it all, right?
Most companies realize that.
Yeah.
But the truth is that it's a lot easier to field bad research.
Yeah.
One of the things that you realize that the better people that are coming out of business schools, the better people that are succeeding in business realize that companies have big problems. Organizationally, they have big problems. They have big problems in terms of convincing consumers to try their products because a lot of products don't deliver, and there's so much that people can learn online about the problems with products. Consumers have a lot more power than they did, 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And I suspect we'll have more power in the future. So, companies they need us. They really need, there have been articles, more than one article written that talks about how desperate companies hire anthropologists.
Yep.
I think they're getting to the point where they probably, at least those who are aware of us, realize they should hire us before they get to the point of desperation.
Right.
A little late.
Well, thank you so much for talking to us today. Really appreciate it, Dr. Morais.
Well, thank you. It was a pleasure.
Yes, and I'll be posting this very soon, probably this Sunday. So, and I'll tag you in it. So we'll see what kind of reactions we get. But it's a really good interview.
Great. Thank you
so much.
Okay.
Bye.